My parents emptied my college fund to pay my sister's debt. Then they told me family comes first. My name is Sarah, and for 18 years I believed my parents when they said the college fund they'd been building since I was born was untouchable, sacred mine. My dad, David, opened that account the year I was born, depositing the very first check from a savings bond his own parents had given him at my birth, treating it like the start of something meaningful rather than just paperwork. Every birthday, every Christmas, relatives would ask what I wanted, and my parents would always say the same thing before I was even old enough to answer for myself. Put something in Sarah's college fund instead of buying toys she'll forget about in a month. By the time I was in high school, it had grown into a serious amount of money, enough to cover a good chunk of a 4-year degree without loans, maybe even all of it depending on where I ended up going. I used to feel almost embarrassed by how much they talked about it at family gatherings, like it was some point of pride they needed everyone to know about, but underneath the embarrassment I felt safe, secure, like no matter what else happened in our family, that one thing was locked in place. My older sister Ashley was a different story entirely. She was 6 years older than me, and by the time I was in middle school, she was already deep into a pattern of decisions that worried my parents constantly, even if they rarely said so directly in front of me. She dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, cycled through a string of retail and restaurant jobs that never lasted more than a few months, and eventually started racking up serious credit card debt trying to keep up with a lifestyle, nice apartment, nice car, constant vacations with friends that she genuinely couldn't afford on any of the incomes she actually had. My parents bailout her out more times than I could count growing up, quietly covering a missed rent payment here, a repossession threat there, always followed by the same lecture about responsibility that never seemed to actually stick with her, no matter how many times they delivered it. I didn't think much of any of it at the time, honestly. It was just how things were in our house. Ashley made messes, my parents cleaned them up, sighing and shaking their heads but never really changing the pattern, and I stayed in my lane, got good grades, stayed out of trouble, and assumed my future was safely locked away in that account with my name on it, separate from whatever chaos my sister kept generating around herself. Senior year of high school, I got accepted into my top choice school, a solid program in a field I'd been working toward for years, the kind of acceptance letter I genuinely cried over when it arrived because it felt like proof that all the effort had actually meant something. I sat down with my parents not long after to talk about using the fund to cover tuition, expecting a fairly straightforward conversation about logistics, how to transfer the money, what the timeline looked like, whether we needed to meet with a financial advisor. That's when my mom, Jennifer, got quiet in a way that immediately made my stomach drop, the kind of quiet that meant something was very wrong before anyone had said a single word. They told me Ashley had gotten into serious trouble. Not just credit card debt this time. She owed money to people who weren't exactly patient about repayment, tied to some situation with an ex-boyfriend and a business venture that had fallen apart, something involving investors who apparently didn't take kindly to losing their money and weren't shy about making that clear to Ashley in ways that frightened my parents enough to act immediately. My parents said they'd had to move fast to protect her, that the situation felt genuinely dangerous, and the only large sum of money they had access to on short notice, without waiting weeks for a loan approval, was my college fund. They'd already spent almost all of it before they even told me any of this was happening. I remember sitting at that table, completely numb, waiting for them to say something that would make this feel less like a betrayal, a plan to pay it back over time, some acknowledgement of what they'd actually taken from me without so much as a conversation first. Instead, my dad looked me dead in the eye, his expression steady in a way that told me he'd already made peace with the decision long before he ever brought it to me, and said, "Family comes first, Sarah. Your sister was in real danger. You'll figure out school, you always do." I wanted to scream. 18 years of birthdays and Christmases funneled into that account, 18 years of being told it was mine, untouchable, sacred, gone in what sounded like a matter of weeks, without so much as a heads up before the money was already spent and the decision already made. I asked what I was supposed to do now, my voice shaking in a way I hated, and my mom suggested community college for a couple years or taking out loans, framing it like an equal trade for what had been quietly, unilaterally taken from me while I was busy filling out my dream school's housing forms. Ashley, for her part, never even apologized directly, not once, not in any real way. She sent one text a few days later saying she felt really bad about the timing, as though the issue was scheduling rather than the fact that her entire life's worth of bad decisions had just consumed my entire future in one swift, unilateral move. Then she went right on living her life, posting vacation photos within the month, like nothing had happened at all, like there hadn't been a debt dangerous enough to justify draining her little sister's college fund without warning. I spent that summer angrier than I'd ever been in my life, cycling through disbelief and rage and a kind of grief I didn't have words for yet, mourning a version of my future that had existed clearly in my mind for years and had now evaporated overnight. But somewhere in the middle of that anger, I also spent the summer planning, because I refused to let their decision be the final word on the rest of my life. I applied for every scholarship I could find, staying up late every night combing through databases, writing essay after essay until my eyes burned. I took a part-time job at a coffee shop near our house, saving every dollar I could. I enrolled in community college with a plan to transfer once I'd rebuilt some savings and proven myself academically to whatever transfer committee would eventually review my application. Wasn't the path I'd imagined for myself, and it stung every single day to watch former classmates post about their dorm move-ins while I commuted to a community college campus that felt like a consolation prize, but I refused to let it become an excuse to give up on the rest of it. Over the next 2 years, I worked harder than I ever had at anything in my life. I kept my grades close to perfect, sacrificing most of my social life in the process, showing up to office hours even when I didn't strictly need to, building relationships with professors who eventually wrote me strong recommendation letters because they'd actually watched me work, not just heard about it secondhand. I applied for a competitive transfer scholarship at the university I'd originally gotten into, the same one my acceptance letter had come from years earlier, the one I'd cried over before everything fell apart. I got it, full tuition plus a stipend for housing, an outcome that felt almost unreal when the email finally arrived, like some kind of correction to a mistake the universe had made. There's a particular memory from that first semester at community college that still sticks with me more than almost anything else from those 2 years. I was sitting in the campus library on a Friday night, working on an essay for a scholarship application while most people my age were out doing whatever normal 18-year-olds do on weekends, when a girl I vaguely recognized from one of my classes sat down across from me and asked what I was working on so late. I explained briefly, without going into the whole backstory, that I was trying to build a case for why a scholarship committee should give a community college transfer student a shot at a 4-year tuition package. She asked, not unkindly, why I hadn't just gone straight to the 4-year school like everyone else in my graduating class seemed to be doing. I gave her some vague answer about family stuff and changed the subject because saying the real reason out loud, that my parents had emptied my college fund to bail out my sister and told me family comes first, still felt too raw to say to a near stranger without my voice cracking. That became something of a pattern over those 2 years. People would ask casually why I was at community college instead of somewhere else, assuming grades or money in the generic sense, and I'd give some abbreviated non-answer rather than explain the actual situation. It wasn't shame exactly, though there was some of that tangled in there too, irrational as it was. It was more that saying it out loud made it real in a way I wasn't always ready to sit with on a random Tuesday between classes. I saved the full version for a handful of people, my roommate at the time, a couple of professors I trusted, and a therapist I started seeing during my second year, mostly because the anger I'd been carrying since that first conversation at the kitchen table had started leaking into parts of my life that had nothing to do with my parents at all. My therapist was the one who first pointed out gently that I'd essentially spent 2 years proving something to people who hadn't actually asked me to prove anything, chasing a level of academic perfection that went beyond what any scholarship committee actually required. As a way of channeling anger I didn't know how else to process. She wasn't wrong. I look back now and recognize that some of those late nights in the library weren't purely strategic. Some of them were about needing to feel, in some measurable, objective way, that I was still worth investing in, even after my own parents had decided I could just figure it out while my sister's mistakes got covered without question. Ashley and I barely spoke during those 2 years, beyond the occasional obligatory text around holidays. It wasn't a dramatic falling out, nothing explosive or confrontational, just a quiet drift that neither of us bothered to fight against. I found out most of what was happening in her life through my mom, who'd mentioned things in passing during our weekly phone calls. Ashley got a new job, Ashley's seeing someone new, Ashley's thinking about moving. I noticed my mom never brought up the debt situation again after that first summer, like it had been quietly filed away as a resolved chapter, even though from where I was sitting, nothing about it had actually been resolved at all. It had just been paid for by me without my consent and then never discussed again. I didn't tell my parents until it was fully official, the funding locked in, the enrollment confirmed, nothing left that could be taken away or second-guessed. When I finally sat them down and told them I'd be attending my dream school after all, fully funded without a cent of their help, my dad's reaction wasn't pride, not really, not in the way I might have hoped for years earlier. It was almost defensive, like he felt some need to remind me that things had worked out fine in the end. So what exactly was the big deal? Why was I still bringing up old history when clearly everything had resolved itself? That's when something in me finally settled, some argument I'd been carrying around silently for 2 years finally finding its shape in words. I told him calmly, without raising my voice, that things working out despite what they did wasn't the same as them being right to have done it in the first place. I told him I understood family means something, that I wasn't asking him to regret helping Ashley in a genuinely dangerous situation, but that family comes first apparently only ever seemed to apply when it meant someone else, meant me, sacrificing something to fix a mess I hadn't created. He didn't have much of an answer for that. My mom looked down at her hands, the same way she had the day they first told me the fund was gone, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. Ashley still hasn't fully paid anyone back for anything, as far as I know. The debt from that situation quietly absorbed into whatever arrangement my parents eventually worked out to keep her safe. She's now asking my parents for help with a car loan. From what I've heard through the grapevine of family group chats, I mostly stay quiet in these days, and from what I understand, they're seriously considering it, the same pattern repeating itself with barely any modification. The same lecture about responsibility no doubt waiting in the wings for whenever this next situation eventually resolves itself, or doesn't. I've made it clear calmly but firmly, in a conversation I rehearsed in my head more times than I'd like to admit before I actually had it, that if that money ever comes from anywhere close to me again, in any form, that will be the last conversation we ever have on the subject, and possibly the last conversation we have at all. My mom cried when I said that, which I expected, and my dad got quiet in the particular way he does when he knows he doesn't have a good counterargument but isn't ready to admit it out loud. Neither of them apologized in the moment, not really, though my mom did call a few days later and say she was sorry I'd felt like I had to say something like that, which isn't quite the same thing as being sorry for what actually happened, but I've learned to take what I can get from people who seem constitutionally unable to fully own a mistake once it's been made. I've thought a lot, especially in therapy, about whether I'll ever fully let go of what happened, or whether some version of that 18-year-old girl sitting at the kitchen table will always be a little bit present whenever I'm around my parents, quietly keeping score, quietly bracing for the next time family loyalty gets redefined in a way that costs me something. I don't have a clean answer for that yet. Some days I feel like I've made peace with it, like the scholarship and the acceptance letter and the diploma I'll be holding next spring are proof enough that I turned their mistake into something I can be proud of regardless of how it started. Other days, usually around the holidays, when Ashley shows up looking effortlessly fine while I'm still quietly recovering from years of having to fight for something that should have already been mine, the old anger surfaces again, sharp and immediate, like no time has passed at all. I graduate next spring debt-free, on a path I built entirely myself after they tried to take it away without so much as a warning. My professors know a version of my story now, the ones who have stuck with me through both schools, and sometimes one of them will mention how far I've come since that first semester at community college, not knowing quite how much further far actually stretches back. I don't know if my parents will ever fully understand why I still keep some distance from them, even now that things have technically worked out. I go to holidays, I show up for the things that matter. But something closed between us the day they handed back an empty account and called it family loyalty, and I've learned that love without respect for what someone actually deserves isn't really love at all. It's just convenience, dressed up in nicer words, waiting for the next crisis to prove the pattern all over again. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if they'd just told me before spending the money instead of after, if they'd sat me down and said, "Your sister is in serious danger. We don't know what else to do. Can we talk about using some of your fund to help her?" I don't know for certain what I would have said, but I'd like to believe I would have found a way to say yes on my own terms, as a choice I actually got to make instead of a decision handed to me after the fact as a done deal I had no say in whatsoever. That's the part that still sits heaviest even now, not that they helped Ashley, not even that it cost me something real. It's that they never once considered I deserved to be part of that decision at all, before deciding, on my behalf, exactly how much of my future I'd be trading away for hers.